He wrapped his arms around me and guided me toward the shower. When he turned the knob, water began flowing, something I didn't have at my own place. Things continued there. I couldn't help but notice the package, so I picked it up, curious, and placed it in my mouth as it disappeared entirely. I slowed down, stopping when I heard the sound it made. A sound I hadn't experienced in what felt like forever. He looked down at me, his expression saying one thing: keep going. Then he leaned his head back, squeezing his eyes shut as if he was completely overcome. He picked up the pace one after another, muttering, "Just trust me, it's coming." I couldn't deny the thrill of it. It's the kind of excitement that grips you, no matter how experienced or new you are to moments like these. Quick narrator note. You're probably wondering where all this is headed. Hold tight, we're getting there. Oh, and while you're here, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It really helps us keep sharing stories like this. Every click, every comment, and every share builds this amazing community we're so grateful to have. Okay, now let me rewind a bit and explain how it all began, because trust me, it's worth the context. It started out as something small, a simple favor, or so I thought. Life in a quiet cul-de-sac is like that. Everyone knows everyone else's business. Neighbors help each other out with little things like borrowing a cup of sugar, picking up someone's mail, or watching their house while they're out of town. It's just part of the suburban charm. So when the Thompsons next door asked me to keep an eye on their house while they were off on a family vacation, I said yes without a second thought. The Thompsons were one of those families everyone liked. Warm, easygoing, and always polite in passing. Their two sons, Logan and Kyle, were in their 20s, young, vibrant, and full of that carefree energy that made people smile just watching them. I'd see them often, shooting hoops in their driveway, washing their car with music blasting, or hauling groceries in with the kind of light-hearted banter that spilled over the fence like sunshine. Logan, the younger one, had this effortless charm. Sandy brown hair always tousled just right and a grin that could brighten up the gloomiest day. Kyle, on the other hand, was quieter, with a brooding intensity in his dark eyes that made him just as captivating in his own way. I'd watched those boys grow up next door, but somewhere along the line they stopped being kids. They were men now, every bit of it. The Thompsons left on a sunny Friday morning, their SUV packed with luggage, snacks, and road trip supplies. I waved them off from my porch, fully expecting the week to be uneventful, watering their plants, bringing in their mail, and making sure everything stayed in order. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then on Saturday morning the water went out. It was one of those rare, calm mornings in our house. My husband, Doug, was upstairs in his office, glued to his work as always. He was the kind of man who didn't bother with the everyday hiccups of suburban life. Those were my domain. "The water's out next door," Doug said casually when I mentioned it, as if it were just another insignificant detail in his busy world. First, it didn't seem like a big deal. I figured I'd head over and check things out. It's what a good neighbor does, right? Walking into the Thompsons' empty house felt odd. Without them there, the space seemed unusually still, like the house itself was holding its breath. The familiar scent of clean laundry and a faint trace of cologne lingered in the air as I moved from room to room, testing faucets and checking for anything unusual. That's when I noticed it, a note left neatly on the kitchen counter. In clean, deliberate handwriting it read, "If there's any trouble, call Logan." Underneath was a phone number. I stood there staring at it, my heart doing this little unsteady jump. At the time it felt like nothing, just a practical message left for emergencies. But something about the stillness of the house and the way sunlight streamed through the window made the moment feel heavier. I was about to dial Logan's number when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of running water. First I thought I was imagining it. The water was supposed to be out, right? But no, it grew louder. A steady drip that turned into a clear rhythm of droplets hitting tile. Curiosity got the better of me, pulling me toward the source of the sound. My bare feet made soft, muted taps on the polished wood floor as I made my way down the hallway, heading for the bathroom the boys used. The door was slightly ajar, and thin tendrils of steam spilled out into the cooler air of the hallway, curling upward like ghostly fingers. My heart began to pound in my chest as I gently pushed the door open, just enough to get a better look. And that's when I saw him, Logan. He stood under the steady stream of water, his head tipped back, letting the droplets cascade over his skin, which seemed to glow with the warmth of the water. The frosted glass of the shower door blurred the details but didn't hide the unmistakable shape of him. A lean, athletic frame carved by years of movement and effort. I felt my breath hitch in my throat. What was Logan doing here? Wasn't he supposed to be out of town with his family? The logical part of me screamed to leave, to quietly turn and walk away as if none of this had ever happened. But I couldn't. My feet were rooted to the floor, frozen in place, while my mind raced through a storm of questions, and something else. Something darker, heavier and far more dangerous stirred within me. A feeling I didn't want to name but couldn't ignore. It pressed down on me, suffocating and irresistible, pulling me deeper into this forbidden moment. Then, as if sensing he wasn't alone, Logan turned. His movements were calm, deliberate, as though he had all the time in the world. For a brief second, I thought the frosted glass might shield me from his view, offering some thin barrier of safety. But then his eyes met mine through the steam and haze, piercing and unflinching. He didn't flinch, didn't rush to cover himself or seem the least bit surprised. Instead, he simply stood there, watching me with a calm, unreadable expression. The silence between us grew heavier by the second, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. But still, I couldn't move. I opened my mouth, desperate to say something, anything, to break the unbearable tension that gripped the air, but no words came out. My mind blanked, leaving me paralyzed under the intensity of his gaze. I gripped the edge of the doorframe as if it could somehow anchor me, stop the world from spinning. Logan must have sensed the chaos roiling inside me because his lips curled into a faint, knowing smirk. It was the kind of look that said he understood exactly what I was feeling. The confusion, the temptation, the undeniable pull that hung between us like a taut wire ready to snap. After what felt like an eternity, Logan stepped out of the bathroom. A towel was slung low around his hips, barely hanging onto his frame. Water droplets still clung to his chest, slowly sliding down the defined lines of his torso like tiny rivers of fire. The air between us felt charged, electric. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, so close it made my pulse race. His deep, unreadable eyes stayed locked on mine, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. "I thought you were on vacation," I finally managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper, as though speaking too loudly would shatter the fragile stillness between us. Logan smirked again, his expression growing even more amused, but he didn't answer. Instead, he leaned forward, casually reaching for another towel on the rack. His arm brushed lightly against mine, the brief contact sending a sharp jolt through me, like static electricity magnified 100-fold. That simple fleeting touch left me reeling, breathless, dizzy, unsure of what to do or say next. "I stayed behind," he said finally, his tone casual, almost dismissive, like this was the most normal conversation in the world. But this wasn't normal. Nothing about this was casual. We weren't in the kitchen chatting over coffee. We were standing inches apart, in the silent, empty house of his family, where every second felt like it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken things. I wanted to demand an explanation, to ask why he hadn't gone with his family, to tell him this was wrong, to remind myself I shouldn't even be here. But the words caught in my throat. I couldn't bring myself to say them. Instead, I stood there, paralyzed, as the tension wrapped around me like a noose, tightening with every heartbeat. And then Logan did something that completely unraveled me. He reached out, his fingers brushing softly against my wrist. The touch was feather-light, almost as if it could have been accidental. But his steady gaze told me it wasn't. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low, laced with a teasing edge that felt like he was savoring every second of this unraveling. It was such a simple question, but it struck something deep within me, something fragile and hidden. In that moment, the walls I had spent years carefully building began to crumble. The image I had created of myself, the reliable neighbor, the loyal wife, shattered like glass. "I should go," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But even as the words left my mouth, my body betrayed me. I didn't move. I couldn't. The words felt hollow, meaningless, against the overwhelming pull that tethered me to him. Logan didn't step back. He didn't give me the space I so desperately told myself I needed. Instead, his hand remained where it was, his thumb tracing slow, deliberate circles against the delicate skin of my wrist. The touch was so soft, so intimate, it felt like the entire world had fallen silent, as if everything beyond this moment had ceased to exist. The tension between us hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Yet I didn't want it to end. I couldn't bring myself to pull away. And then it happened. A moment so charged with inevitability that I couldn't say who moved first. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was him. Or maybe it was something bigger than both of us, something that had been building from the moment our eyes met. Before I could make sense of it, the space between us disappeared. His lips met mine, soft yet urgent, igniting a fire in me that had been dormant for longer than I cared to admit. The kiss wasn't long, just a stolen moment, brief and fleeting. But it was enough to send my world spinning. When we finally pulled apart, his gaze bore into mine, searching, challenging, daring me to admit the truth we both already knew but hadn't spoken. His eyes, deep and unreadable, seemed to hold all the questions I was too afraid to answer. The steam from the shower still clung to the bathroom walls, mingling with the lingering heat of the moment. My chest felt tight, my breath shallow, as if the air around us had thickened to the point of suffocation. I hadn't planned for this. None of this. But even as my mind screamed at me to leave, my body refused to comply. Each step I took toward the door felt like trudging through quicksand, every movement slower and heavier than the last. And just as I thought I might finally escape, I felt it, that undeniable pull behind me, his presence like gravity itself. I turned and there he was, standing just inches away. The towel that hung loosely around his hips threatened to slip with each small movement, clinging to him in a way that made it clear he wasn't ready to let go of it, of me, of this moment. Droplets of water still lingered on his skin, catching the dim light streaming through the frosted window, and making him look almost otherworldly, like he was glowing from within. He took a step closer, and the air between us seemed to crackle, alive with the charged energy I couldn't escape. My back met the hallway wall, cool against my overheated skin, and a shiver rippled through me, not from the cold but from the intensity of what was unfolding. His fingers found my wrist again, but this time there was no hesitation. His touch was steady, grounding me even as I felt like I might drift away, lost in the storm of emotions swirling around us. Everywhere his fingers traveled, they left a trail of fire in their wake, a heat that burned through the fabric of who I thought I was. I closed my eyes, hoping to steady myself, but instead the sensations only deepened. The faint scent of soap clinging to his skin, the damp warmth radiating off him, the sound of our uneven breaths filling the silence. When his hand reached my shoulder, he paused, his thumb brushing against the curve of my collarbone with the lightest of touches. It was such a small, subtle gesture, yet it felt like the ground beneath me had disappeared entirely. I opened my eyes, and the intensity in his gaze wiped away any last shred of reason or restraint I had left. There was no space for logic or rules anymore. There was only him, only us, and the current of electricity that now surged between us, making it impossible to breathe, let alone think. He leaned down, resting his forehead against mine, the closeness making my heart race even faster. His breath, warm and tinged with the faintest trace of mint, ghosted over my cheek, mingling with the heat that radiated from his body. And then his lips found mine again. This time the kiss was slow, unhurried, as though he wanted to savor every second, every movement, every stolen moment that was never meant to be. It wasn't rushed or desperate. It was deliberate, filled with a quiet intensity that made the world around us fall away. The outline of his body beneath the towel was unmistakable, drawing my attention and quickening my breath. Desire coursed through me as I fought to steady myself, but my resolve was already a fragile thing, and his touch only unraveled it further. When his hands found my waist, he pulled me closer. So close there wasn't a sliver of space left between us. His fingers pressed firmly against my hips, his palms warm and commanding as they slid along my back. His touch was everywhere at once, branding itself onto my skin like a memory I'd never be able to erase. Without a word, he led me into the shower, the sound of running water filling the small, steamy room. It was a sound I hadn't heard in so long, not in my own house. The droplets cascaded down over us, mingling with the heat of the moment. The steam wrapped around us like a veil, blurring the edges of reality, isolating us in this secret, forbidden world. Every movement, every touch was charged with an intensity one hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. His lips found mine again, insistent yet tender, and my hands wandered instinctively, tracing the hard lines of his shoulders, the taut muscles of his chest. My fingertips trailed over the water droplets that clung to him, and I marveled at how natural it felt, as though I'd known this body forever. The longing in his touch mirrored my own, raw and unspoken. His hands gripped my hips, steadying me as though I might drift away. I gasped softly as his fingers tightened, pulling me into him, and my breath was swallowed by another deep, consuming kiss. This one was more intense, more desperate, as if we both knew we were crossing a line we could never return from but couldn't bring ourselves to stop. The water streamed around us, and the world outside seemed to dissolve. Time became meaningless. Every second stretched into an eternity, and every touch felt both endless and fleeting. And in that stolen moment as we moved together, every boundary I had ever drawn was obliterated. His presence consumed me, his hands guiding me in ways that felt both unfamiliar and inevitable. My mind screamed that this was wrong, but my body answered with an unrelenting certainty that it was exactly where I was meant to be. As his lips traced the curve of my neck, my pulse raced wildly. Every part of me burned with a desire I couldn't extinguish, a need I couldn't deny. His hands, his mouth, his body, they all spoke a language that bypassed words entirely, one that I felt down to my very core. The connection between us was electric, magnetic, something I knew I could never explain. Each touch, each kiss, each shiver that ran through me felt sacred somehow, dangerously sacred. And when it was over, when we were left standing in the aftermath of our shared indiscretion, the weight of it hit me all at once. This moment, this forbidden exchange, would live in the shadowy corners of my mind forever. It would haunt me, a vivid memory etched into the fabric of my existence, whispering of boundaries crossed and consequences yet to come. I knew it couldn't last. I knew the real world would intrude soon enough, but for now I allowed myself to linger in this stolen moment, in the warmth of his presence, in the echo of his touch. As I pulled away, my chest heavy with conflicting emotions, I glanced back at him one last time, knowing this memory would be burned into my soul.